You know that moment when you're learning how to teach something and you can't help but wonder if you're being taught well. Have you ever had that thought rattling around in your head during a training session or maybe even a college course designed for future educators? That's exactly the question we're wrestling with today. We're diving deep into a really thought-provoking 1997 study by Kenneth Kira and Patty Gubbles that takes a hard look at educational psychology courses. You know, those foundational courses meant to equip you, the future teachers of the world, with the essential understanding of how learning and development actually work.
Absolutely. And our mission in this deep dive is to unearth some truly crucial insights from the research. Kieran and Gubbles asked a deceptively simple yet incredibly important question. Are these educational psychology courses genuinely educationally and psychologically found? It almost feels like a paradox, doesn't it? Courses dedicated to the science of learning, potentially not applying those very principles themselves.
It does. And to get to the bottom of this, they gathered some compelling evidence. They surveyed teachers out in the field, asking them about their experiences in these educational psychology courses. Plus, they meticulously analyzed 11 of the leading educational psychology textbooks from the 1990s. So we're getting a picture from two key angles: the perspective of those who went through the training people, just like you might be, and, well, the resources that were shaping their learning.
What's fascinating right from the outset, and maybe a little unsettling, is the inherent tension the researchers uncovered. Their initial, very reasonable expectation was that these courses led by experts in the very field of learning and teaching should be the gold standard, right? The best examples of effective instruction on any university campus. But as we explore their findings, you'll see that the reality they discovered painted a somewhat different picture.
Okay, let's unpack the first big idea that Kira and Gubbles put forward. They said that educational psychology courses should be fundamentally driven by overarching teaching models. Now, when you first hear that, it might sound a bit abstract. What does that actually mean for someone like you taking one of these courses?
Think of it this way. Imagine you're signing up for a course to learn how to train a dog. Okay.
Mm.
Now, what if that course just threw a bunch of disconnected topics at you? Maybe dog breeds, the history of dog training, canine nutrition, research methods in animal behavior, and, as the study amusingly points out, perhaps even 14 seemingly random topics. You might accumulate a lot of facts, but would you walk away with a clear understanding of how to effectively train a dog to sit, stay, or fetch? Probably not.
Right. It feels kind of superficial, like you're just ticking boxes on a curriculum rather than actually learning a process. I can definitely see how that scattered approach wouldn't be very helpful if you were trying to get your own furry friend to
Yeah.
cooperate.
Exactly. The researchers contrast this with the idea of a dog training model, a clear framework that lays out the specific steps involved in training, the essential knowledge you need about dog behavior and learning principles at each stage, and crucially, the reasoning behind each step. This kind of model provides a roadmap, a structure that makes sense of all the individual pieces of information.
And this isn't just a good idea in theory, is it? There's solid research backing up why these overarching models are so important for learning.
Absolutely. Kira and Gubbles connect this directly to schema theory, going back to the foundational work of Piaget and Inhelder on how we organize information in our minds. Think of schemas as your existing mental frameworks for understanding the world, like your how to order coffee schema that guides your actions when you walk into a cafe. When a course is built around a clear teaching model, it helps you, the learner, integrate new information into those existing structures, making it much easier to understand and then apply that knowledge to solve problems later on.
So, a well-defined teaching model in an educational psychology course acts almost like a mental scaffolding, helping you build a coherent understanding of effective teaching.
Precisely. And building on this, Mayer's research on conceptual models shows that things like diagrams or even clear verbal descriptions of how a system works are incredibly helpful in building these mental models. They highlight the critical components and, importantly, how they relate to each other, giving you that essential framework before you get bogged down in the individual details.
That makes perfect sense. So, instead of just bombarding future teachers like you with a laundry list of theories and concepts, a central teaching model for educational psychology would give you a clear, actionable roadmap of what effective teaching actually looks like in practice. Can you give us a tangible example of what one of these models might look like in the context of teacher training?
Well, the study itself points to Bransford and Stein's ideal problem-solving model as a useful analogy. IDEAL stands for Identify, Define, Explore, Act, and Look Back. Their entire book is structured around this model. consistently helping readers integrate the concepts they present within that problem-solving framework when tackling new challenges. Now imagine a similar model for teaching. It could outline the different phases of instruction, perhaps from initial planning and setting objectives all the way through to assessment and reflection, clearly identifying the key knowledge and skills you need at each stage.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, how did the educational psychology textbooks that Kira and Gubbles analyzed actually measure up against this fundamental principle of being driven by a clear teaching model?
This is where the findings become quite eye-opening. Out of the 11 textbooks they examined, only 2 specifically, those by Beeler and Snowman and by Gage and Berliner, actually presented a comprehensive teaching model right at the beginning of the book, and they consistently organized their content around that model. For example, Beeler and Snowman's model included key phases, like carefully considering the characteristics of your students and clearly specifying the learning outcomes you want them to achieve. Gage and Berliner's model, as the study illustrates in a figure, explicitly outlines stages such as deciding on your instructional objectives and then choosing appropriate teaching methods, directly linking each of these stages to relevant chapters within the textbook.
Only 2 out of 11. Wow. That feels like a staggering oversight, especially when you consider that these are the very resources meant to guide and prepare future educators like you.
It is a significant finding. The researchers observed that the vast majority of the other textbooks were structured more like encyclopedias of educational psychology. They averaged around 17 chapters, with some ballooning to as many as 29. The primary focus seemed to be on presenting a wide array of different perspectives, various theories of motivation, different stages of development, a multitude of learning theories, rather than offering a cohesive and unified framework for what constitutes effective teaching in practice.
So instead of providing you, the future teacher, with a clear roadmap to effective instruction, these textbooks were offering more of a broad survey of different theoretical landscapes.
Precisely. The researchers even highlight that fundamental aspects of instructional design, such as methods for writing clear learning objectives or different ways of classifying learning outcomes, were often presented as topics of ongoing debate within the texts themselves. It gave the impression of a survey course designed for someone aiming to specialize in educational psychology research rather than, a practical user-friendly handbook for someone actively preparing to enter the classroom.
And what did the teachers who were surveyed, people who had actually gone through these courses, have to say about this broad and seemingly unfocused approach?
Their feedback strongly echoed this concern. An overwhelming 75% of the teachers surveyed reported that their educational psychology courses covered 10 or more distinct topics. And when asked about their preferences, they overwhelmingly favored a much more focused approach. In fact, when presented with hypothetical course outlines, the teachers consistently rated a more streamlined course that concentrated on just 5 key topics, with a strong emphasis on practical instructional planning and effective learning strategies as significantly more valuable than the traditional broad coverage course they had experienced.
That really speaks volumes about their experience, doesn't it? They went through the broad coverage firsthand and realized that it wasn't necessarily what they needed most to be effective in their actual teaching. The study even includes a powerful quote from one teacher who suggested that if fewer topics were covered, more valuable time could be dedicated to exploring applicable strategies and techniques in greater depth.
That's a crucial takeaway for you to consider. These practicing teachers clearly valued depth of understanding and direct relevance to their day-to-day work in the classroom over a superficial overview of a wide range of theoretical perspectives.
Okay, so the first key principle is all about having a clear and overarching model to guide the learning. What's the second crucial principle that Kira and Gubbles identified as essential for sound educational psychology courses?
The second vital principle is that educational psychology courses must actively integrate theory and practice. The fundamental idea here is to help you, as a future teacher, avoid what's often referred to as inert knowledge, that frustrating situation where you learn a lot of information but struggle to actually apply it effectively in real-world situations.
Inert knowledge. That sounds like a really common trap in a lot of learning environments, not just in education. Can you give us a concrete example of how this might manifest itself in the context of educational psychology?
Sure. Consider the concept of shaping from operant conditioning theory. You might learn the textbook definition. You might even understand the underlying principles of reinforcement and successive approximations. But unless you see that theory explicitly applied in a practical context, for example, how a teacher can use shaping techniques to encourage a shy student to participate more actively in class discussions, or even going back to our earlier analogy, how it's used in dog training, it's likely to remain just an abstract concept. something you can define on a test but not actually use in practice.
So the theoretical understanding is there, but the critical bridge to real-world application is missing, leaving the knowledge, essentially. Well, useless in action.
Exactly. And the study's analysis of the textbooks revealed a significant and concerning separation between the presentation of theory and the discussion of practical application. On average, the researchers identified around 5 chapters in each textbook that were primarily dedicated to teaching psychological theory and isolation chapters, focusing on behaviorism, cognitivism, theories of motivation, and stages of development.
That's a significant portion of the textbook dedicated purely to theoretical frameworks, often presented in isolation.
It is. And the researchers point to a particularly revealing example of this disconnect: the common separation of behavioral learning theory and the practical strategies of classroom management. They found that only one of the 11 textbooks actually integrated these two crucial areas within a single chapter. The rest taught the theory of behaviorism in one section of the book, and then, often much later, an average of 5 unrelated chapters later, they would discuss specific classroom management techniques.
Wow, that's a real disconnect. It's almost like learning all about the internal combustion engine in one part of a car mechanics course, and then in a completely separate section weeks later, learning how to drive a car without ever explicitly connecting how the engine's principles relate to acceleration or braking.
Precisely. If you, as a future teacher, don't clearly see how the fundamental principles of behavioral learning theory directly underpin effective classroom management strategies, you might not intuitively recognize when and how to apply those strategies in your own classroom. The study references Simon's insightful idea of conditionalized knowledge here, knowing not just what something is, but also understanding the specific conditions under which it's most applicable and effective. This same pattern of separation was also observed with cognitive learning theory being taught in isolation from practical instruction on instructional planning and teaching specific learning strategies.
And again, what did the teachers who were surveyed report about their experiences with this separation of theory and practice in their educational psychology courses?
Their firsthand experiences mirror the findings from the textbook analysis. A large majority, 81% of the teachers, confirmed that their educational psychology courses indeed taught theory largely in isolation from practical application. Many of them specifically commented that while they could recall the various theories that were taught, they struggled to remember how those theories directly related to the real-world challenges and situations they faced in their own classrooms. One teacher even poignantly stated, "I remember educational psychology as being about different men and their theories. I don't remember those theories ever being explicitly related to me and the everyday realities of classroom situations."
That really drives home the problem of inert knowledge, doesn't it? These teachers had the theoretical building blocks, but they lacked the crucial blueprint for how to assemble those blocks into practical solutions in their own teaching.
Absolutely. And this disconnect likely helps to explain why, when the teachers were asked to rank the importance of different educational psychology topics, they overwhelmingly rated classroom management as the most important area, while they ranked behavior theory much lower down the list, at 13th. They simply didn't perceive a clear and direct link between the underlying psychological theory and the practical application they valued most in their daily work.
Okay, so Principle 2 is all about actively bridging that crucial gap between theoretical understanding and practical application in the classroom. What's the third essential principle for designing sound educational psychology courses?
Principle number 3 strongly emphasizes the critical need for educational psychology courses to provide you, as future teachers, with meaningful opportunities to actually practice the core skills of teaching. The researchers argue that simply learning about various teaching skills isn't sufficient. You need hands-on practice to truly develop those skills and become proficient in their application.
That makes perfect intuitive sense. You can read countless books and watch numerous videos about riding a bicycle, but you won't actually learn how to ride until you get on one and start pedaling, probably with a few wobbly moments along the way. How does this fundamental principle of practice apply to the complex skills of teaching?
Well, think about essential teaching skills, like developing clear and measurable learning objectives, designing effective test and assessment questions, planning a well-structured and engaging lesson, or skillfully using a variety of different teaching strategies. These aren't just abstract theoretical concepts that you can passively absorb. They are actual performance skills that teachers need to be able to execute fluently and effectively in the dynamic environment of a classroom. The study highlights the important distinction between declarative knowledge, knowing about these things, and the development of procedural knowledge, actually knowing how to do them. And that how to only comes with practice.
So it's the fundamental difference between understanding the theoretical principles of effective lesson planning and actually being able to sit down and create a well-structured and engaging lesson plan that will work in your classroom.
Exactly, and the researchers emphasize that this practice should ideally be anchored in realistic and complex educational scenarios, what they refer to as rich, authentic macro contexts. Imagine being presented with a detailed case study of a challenging classroom situation, perhaps through video or a well-written narrative, where you have to analyze the problem, identify appropriate instructional strategies, and make decisions about how to respond. This kind of realistic anchor allows you, the future teacher, to practice multiple related teaching skills in an integrated and meaningful way.
Almost like a flight simulator for aspiring pilots, but for teaching.
That's a really insightful analogy. In a flight simulator, you're not just practicing one isolated skill in a vacuum, you're experiencing how various skills interact and need to be applied together within a realistic and often demanding setting. The study highlights several key advantages of this problem-oriented, case-based approach to learning. It not only helps prospective teachers develop their problem-solving skills in educational contexts, but also improves their ability to recognize different types of problems when they encounter them in their own classrooms. Furthermore, it allows for the integrated practice of related skills, showing how they complement and build upon each other. And perhaps most importantly, it significantly improves retrieval when you face similar situations as a practicing teacher. You can draw upon those practice scenarios and the problem-solving strategies you developed.
So, how did the educational psychology textbooks that were analyzed by Kira and Gubbles measure up when it came to providing these absolutely crucial practice opportunities for future teachers?
Unfortunately, the findings in this area were quite concerning. The study revealed that a significant majority, 6 out of the 11 textbooks they examined, provided absolutely no opportunities for future teachers to practice fundamental teaching skills. Among the 5 textbooks that did offer some form of practice, it was often quite limited in scope, perhaps focusing on a single skill in isolation, such as writing learning objectives, and it was typically done without any meaningful connection to related skills, like designing assessment questions or conducting a thorough instructional analysis.
And the crucial element of feedback, which is so absolutely essential for skill development in any domain, was also often missing in these limited practice opportunities, wasn't it?
Precisely. 4 of the 5 textbooks that even offered any form of practice unfortunately didn't provide any feedback whatsoever on the appropriateness or effectiveness of the responses. Without timely and constructive feedback, mere repetition or practice alone is unlikely to lead to the development of true expertise. And crucially, as we discussed earlier, none of the textbooks effectively utilized those rich, authentic case study anchors that the researchers strongly advocated for as a powerful way to integrate practice.
It really sounds like the textbooks were overwhelmingly focused on presenting information about the theory and concepts of teaching, rather than actively engaging and involving future teachers in the actual doing of teaching.
That's a perfectly concise summary of the situation this study revealed. And the results from the survey of practicing teachers sadly echoed the significant lack of practical experience in their training.
Yeah.
Only about half of them, a mere 52%, reported that their educational psychology courses even required them to complete any significant projects that involved the application of their knowledge, such as designing a full lesson plan or constructing a comprehensive test or assessment.
That means that nearly half of the individuals who were going through these courses to become teachers were graduating without any substantial hands-on application of the very principles and skills they were supposed to be learning.
Exactly. And in their open-ended comments on the survey, many teachers explicitly expressed this fundamental need for more practical application in their educational psychology training. One teacher powerfully wrote, "I definitely needed the foundational background information, yes, but what I needed even more was the how-to of its actual application in the classroom." Several teachers even went so far as to specifically suggest intentionally tying the educational psychology course directly to a required practicum or field experience to provide that absolutely essential element of real-world practice.
Okay, we've now explored the critical importance of overarching teaching models, the essential integration of theory and practice, and the vital need for opportunities to practice teaching skills. What is the fourth key principle that Kira and Gubbles identified as crucial for effective educational psychology courses?
The fourth principle really focuses on the idea that educational psychology courses should explicitly present a complete and, importantly, an integrated model for instructional planning. This is, after all, a core and fundamental responsibility for all teachers, and the researchers convincingly argue that future educators like you need to be equipped with a clear and systematic approach to designing effective and impactful instruction.
What specific kind of instructional planning model are they referring to here?
They specifically highlight the value of Gagne's well-regarded systems approach to instructional planning. This is a comprehensive and interconnected model that involves several key steps. First, clearly defining your intended learning goals. Second, conducting a thorough instructional analysis to break down exactly what needs to be taught to achieve those goals. Third, writing specific and measurable learning objectives that align with those goals. Fourth, developing corresponding and appropriate test and assessment items to measure student learning. Fifth, carefully planning the specific lesson activities and instructional strategies you will use. And finally, developing or selecting the necessary instructional materials to support your teaching. The crucial aspect here is the integrative nature of these steps. They are not isolated activities, but rather a logical sequence that all work together in a cohesive way.
Can you walk us through a quick, concrete example of how this type of integrated instructional planning model might work in practice for a teacher?
Sure. Let's imagine a teacher wants to teach their students how to correctly capitalize proper nouns in their writing. Following Gagne's model, the teacher would first clearly define the overall learning goal. Then they would conduct an instructional analysis, breaking down the task into its component parts, for example, understanding what a noun is, and then learning to distinguish between common and proper nouns. Next, they would write specific and measurable learning objectives, such as students will be able to correctly identify proper nouns in a sentence with 90% accuracy. Following this, they would develop test items that directly assess this specific objective. The lesson plan would then outline the various instructional activities they would use to teach these skills. And finally, they would develop or gather appropriate instructional materials, such as worksheets with practice sentences or examples of proper nouns used in context.
So it's a very systematic and logical flow that starts with the overarching learning goal and then carefully breaks it down into specific steps, ensuring that everything, the objectives, the activities, and the assessments are all directly aligned.
Precisely. And Gagne also made important distinctions between different categories of human performance, such as verbal information, intellectual skills, motor skills, attitudes, and cognitive strategies, and emphasized how these different types of learning outcomes should influence every aspect of instructional planning, from how you write your objectives to how you design your teaching methods and your assessment strategies.
It sounds like a really robust and thoughtful framework for ensuring that instruction is not only well organized, but also truly effective in helping students achieve the desired learning outcomes. So, how well did the educational psychology textbooks in the study cover this type of integrated instructional planning model for future teachers?
Unfortunately, the analysis revealed another significant gap in this critical area as well. The study found that only 3 out of the 11 textbooks actually presented an overarching and relatively complete model of instructional planning that included most of these essential interconnected components. A few other textbooks focused solely on the much narrower aspect of writing and classifying instructional objectives, while still others touched upon various planning-related topics in isolation, but ultimately failed to demonstrate how they all fit together as a cohesive and systematic process.
So you might learn about the importance of writing objectives in one chapter and perhaps read something about different lesson planning formats much later in the book, but without ever seeing the comprehensive and logical system that effectively ties all of these elements together.
Exactly. And while most of the textbooks did mention the concept of learning outcomes in some capacity, they often only connected them to the initial step of classifying objectives, largely neglecting the absolutely crucial link between those desired learning outcomes and the development of appropriate and aligned test and assessment items. The systematic and iterative process of instructional planning itself was rarely explicitly demonstrated or modeled for the future teachers. The researchers noted that in not a single case were readers clearly shown how to apply all the essential steps of a comprehensive instructional planning model to the actual design of instruction in a specific subject area.
And once again, the experiences of the teachers who were surveyed seem to strongly reflect this lack of emphasis on systematic instructional planning in their training, right?
Yes, that's correct. Only a small percentage, a mere 39% of the teachers surveyed, reported that their educational psychology course actually taught them how to plan instruction in a systematic way, using a step-by-step approach similar to Gagne's model. Even fewer, only 29%, felt that they had learned how to effectively teach for different and specific types of learning outcomes.
Despite this apparent lack of explicit instruction in their courses, the teachers did clearly recognize and articulate the significant value they placed on being able to effectively plan instruction, didn't they?
Absolutely. When presented with the hypothetical course options, they rated the course that explicitly included instruction on both systematic instructional planning and effective learning strategies as the most valuable among the four options presented. A large majority, 85%, ranked it as either the most or the second most valuable course. One teacher even specifically commented on how incredibly beneficial it would have been to have the opportunity to design actual lessons for their own curriculum as part of their educational psychology coursework.
That really underscores the significant practical need for this kind of integrated and systematic approach to instructional planning and teacher education.
It certainly does. It clearly highlights the fact that teachers in the field deeply understand the fundamental importance of being able to effectively design and deliver instruction that leads to meaningful student learning, even if their own educational psychology courses weren't adequately preparing them to do so.
Okay, let's move on to the fifth crucial principle identified by Kira and Gubbles. The importance of educational psychology courses actively preparing future teachers to effectively teach learning strategies to their own students. This sounds incredibly important. It's not just about teaching content, but about teaching students how to learn that content effectively.
It is absolutely fundamental for developing independent and successful learners. The researchers define learning strategies as those specific cognitive operations that go beyond simply executing a task. Things like actively questioning the text as you read, making predictions about what will come next, effectively organizing information you're learning, and summarizing key ideas in your own words. These are the essential tools that help students become autonomous learners, capable of learning effectively, even when direct instruction isn't ideal or even absent.
So it's really about equipping students with the crucial skills to essentially become their own best teachers in the long run.
Precisely. And there's a wealth of compelling research that consistently shows that students who are strategic learners significantly outperform those who don't effectively use these strategies. Furthermore, studies have shown that even high-achieving students don't always spontaneously employ sophisticated learning strategies in a consistent or effective manner. This strongly suggests that explicit instruction in these strategies is often absolutely necessary.
It's interesting that you mentioned that even top-performing students don't always intuitively use these strategies. You might naturally assume that they've just figured out the best way to learn.
That's a very common and understandable misconception. While high-achieving students might have developed some effective learning habits over time, they might not be consciously aware of and strategically applying a full range of powerful learning strategies. Explicit and direct instruction in these strategies can help make these learning processes more conscious, more readily available, and more consistently applied by all students.
So, if these learning strategies are so incredibly important for student success, are practicing teachers generally spending a significant amount of their instructional time explicitly teaching these strategies in their classrooms?
Unfortunately, classroom observation studies have revealed that teachers actually tend to spend a surprisingly small amount of their valuable instructional time explicitly teaching learning strategies to their students. Some of the research cited in the Kira and Gubbles study found that explicit strategy instruction occupied less than a mere 2% of total instructional time in many classrooms.
That's a shockingly small amount of dedicated time for such a crucial set of skills. What might be some of the underlying barriers that could help explain this apparent lack of focus on teaching learning strategies?
The researchers suggest a couple of key interconnected barriers. One is the possibility that some teachers might hold what's known as an entity view of intelligence, the somewhat limiting belief that a student's learning ability is largely fixed and primarily determined by their innate intelligence. If teachers hold this perspective, they might inadvertently see their role as primarily transmitting knowledge, with students' learning outcomes being largely dependent on these inherent and perhaps unchangeable intellectual factors rather than on teachable learning strategies.
That's a pretty restrictive perspective for an educator to hold. It almost implies that some students are just naturally good at learning and others simply aren't, and there's not much a teacher can do to significantly influence that.
Exactly. But as Perkins astutely points out, a more empowering view is that learning ability is actually a dynamic combination of a student's intelligence, their existing knowledge base, and crucially, the repertoire of effective learning strategies they possess. He argues that while innate intelligence might be challenging to change quickly, explicitly teaching students effective learning strategies can often lead to immediate and noticeable improvements in their learning outcomes. The second significant barrier, as you might anticipate based on our earlier discussions, is that prospective teachers themselves might not have been adequately trained in the nature of various learning strategies, or, more importantly, in effective methods for how to teach these strategies to their own students.
So if future teachers like you weren't explicitly taught these valuable learning strategies and how to teach them during your own educational psychology courses, it seems less likely that you would feel confident or prepared to then teach them effectively to your own students in the future.
Precisely. It unfortunately creates a potential cycle where this crucial aspect of instruction is consistently underemphasized. And the Kira and Gubble study found that while the surveyed teachers actually ranked the importance of teaching learning strategies as the fourth most important topic they could cover in their educational psychology training, a significant majority, a full 75%, reported that their own educational psychology courses didn't adequately cover learning strategies or, more importantly, provide any instruction on how to effectively teach them to students.
That's a huge and troubling disconnect between what practicing teachers recognize as important for student success and what they themselves feel they were actually taught in their teacher preparation.
It is a significant missed opportunity. And the researchers' analysis of the educational psychology textbooks wasn't much more encouraging in this regard. While the majority of the textbooks did include some general information about various learning strategies, only a little over half of them actually addressed the crucial aspect of how to teach these strategies to students. And even when they did, these topics typically received very little dedicated space on average, only about 2% of the total pages in the textbooks. The coverage often focused on summarizing research findings related to the effectiveness of different strategies, rather than providing clear, practical guidelines and concrete examples for how future teachers could effectively instruct their own students in using these valuable techniques.
So future teachers might learn about the existence of effective strategies like note-taking, comprehension monitoring, or using mnemonics, but they wouldn't necessarily learn how to explicitly teach their own students the specific steps involved in using these techniques effectively.
Exactly. The researchers critique this textbook coverage as often being minimal, superficial, and in some ways even misguided. They noted a general lack of explicit modeling of these strategies, a lack of guidance on how to effectively combine different strategies, insufficient information on the crucial aspect of conditional knowledge, knowing when and why to use a particular strategy, and a notable absence of meaningful opportunities for future teachers to practice teaching these strategies themselves. The emphasis tended to be more on presenting research findings rather than offering clear and actionable guidelines for classroom instruction, with very few examples of how strategy instruction could be seamlessly embedded within regular subject matter teaching.
Okay, that paints a pretty clear picture of another significant missed opportunity in the way future teachers were being prepared. Let's move on to the sixth and final principle that Kira and Gubbles discuss in their insightful study.
The sixth and final principle is absolutely fundamental. Educational psychology courses themselves should serve as exemplary models of effective pedagogy and should actively focus on helping their own students who, of course, are the future teachers, learn effectively.
This feels almost like a no-brainer, doesn't it? The very people who are tasked with teaching future educators about effective teaching and learning should probably be demonstrating those very same principles in their own classrooms.
You would certainly think so. The researchers present a clear and compelling scenario of two hypothetical instructors. Instructor A consistently uses effective teaching techniques, such as providing clear learning objectives at the start of each lesson, utilizing graphic organizers to help structure information, offering concrete examples to illustrate abstract concepts, and regularly asking thoughtful questions to engage students and check for understanding. In contrast, Instructor B primarily relies on lecturing without incorporating these learner-centered supports. It becomes pretty obvious which instructor students are likely to learn more effectively and develop a deeper understanding of the material.
Instructor A sounds like they are intentionally designing their instruction to be highly learner-compatible, aligning their teaching methods with how the human brain best processes and retains information.
Exactly. They are consciously aligning their teaching methods with well-established principles of how the brain processes and learns new information. For example, providing clear objectives helps students focus their attention and understand what's important. Effectively using graphic organizers aids in the organization and retention of complex information. Offering relevant examples promotes the crucial integration of new knowledge with prior understanding. And asking thoughtful questions actively encourages students to monitor their own comprehension and engage more deeply with the material.
So, the instructors teaching educational psychology to future teachers like you should really be walking the walk and demonstrating effective instruction firsthand by using the very same techniques they're teaching about in their own courses.
Absolutely. They should be providing a living, breathing model of effective instructional practices. However, the findings from the teacher survey in this area were quite sobering. Only a small fraction, a mere 27% of the teachers, agreed with the statement that their educational psychology course served as a good model of how to teach effectively. Many teachers commented on how little they actually remembered from the course, or even expressed the feeling that the course was largely worthless in preparing them for the realities of teaching, strongly suggesting that the instruction they received was not particularly effective or memorable.
That's a pretty significant and concerning indictment, isn't it? If the future teachers themselves aren't experiencing effective teaching and learning in these foundational courses, what hope is there that they will then be able to effectively teach their own students in the future?
It raises a very serious concern about the overall effectiveness of teacher preparation. The analysis of the textbooks offered a slightly more positive picture on the surface, with the majority of texts reporting that they used objectives or included questions for the reader, and also incorporating numerous graphic organizers to visually represent information. However, the researchers point out a critical flaw. These textbooks very rarely check to see if readers actually met the stated objectives or answered the embedded questions correctly, missing a crucial element of effective instruction, active engagement, and feedback.
So while some potentially helpful tools like objectives and graphic organizers might have been present in the textbooks, the crucial elements of active engagement and meaningful feedback, which are hallmarks of effective pedagogy, were often missing.
Precisely. While the inclusion of graphic organizers, for example, was a positive finding in some respects, their mere presence in a textbook isn't sufficient to ensure effective learning. Effective pedagogy requires actively guiding students through the material, consistently checking for understanding, and providing timely and constructive feedback to support their learning. The fact that so few teachers felt that their educational psychology course actually modeled effective teaching highlights a significant area that desperately needed improvement.
Well, this deep dive into Kira and Gubbels' study has certainly revealed some incredibly interesting and, frankly, a little concerning findings about how educational psychology was being taught back in the 1990s. Just to quickly recap for you, the 6 key principles for a sound educational psychology course that emerged from their research are: first, being fundamentally driven by overarching teaching models; second, actively integrating theory and practical application; third, providing ample opportunities for future teachers to practice essential teaching skills; fourth, presenting a complete and integrated model for effective instructional planning; fifth, explicitly preparing teachers to effectively teach learning strategies to their own students; and sixth, ensuring that the educational psychology course itself serves as a model of effective pedagogy.
That's an excellent summary. And as the study clearly suggests, there appeared to be a significant gap between these research-backed principles of effective learning and teaching and the actual reality of how these crucial courses were often structured and delivered to future educators.
So, as you navigate your own learning journey, whether you're actively preparing to become a teacher or simply striving to master a new skill in your professional life, I encourage you to really consider this. How do the learning principles we've discussed today resonate with your own experiences as a learner? What aha moments did this deep dive spark for you about how you learn best, or what specific elements you truly value in effective instruction? Have the various educational experiences you've had throughout your life consistently embodied these sound psychological and educational principles? It's definitely something powerful to reflect on.